Hi, everyone. I just wanted to share with you a very easy and visual framework that I have to think about antifragility, not just to understand what antifragility is, but most importantly, to know what to do about it. So, of course, antifragility is a term that has been coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb's, and it describes things that gain from disorder. So basically we can classify things as fragile, robust, or antifragile. Some things are fragile, and that means that they suffer from variation, usage, or problems and feedback. For example, my computer is fragile. The more I use it, the more it's likely that it will break down. Other things are robust. They do not really care if and how much they've been used. And finally, there are things which are anti-fragile, and they actually benefit from variation, usage, problems, and feedback. So for example, a car is fragile because the more you use it, the less its value, the more it is likely to break down. Conversely, a dog is anti-fragile. If you do not use it, so if you keep it in an apartment and he doesn't have the chance to run or to play outside, for example, the dog will look older, sick, and so on. A town or a city, it's both fragile and anti-fragile. Its buildings, for example, on one side they are fragile because the more you use them, the more they're likely to get damaged. On the other hand, they're also anti-fragile because if we build a building and it gets damaged, for example, it crumbles during an earthquake, we learn how to build better buildings, and the next buildings that we build will be better. So the town is, in a way, is both fragile and anti-fragile, and it depends from the mechanisms that are inside. And also couple, for example, is both fragile and anti-fragile. For example, the couple might have a discussion which is big enough to break the couple, and that would be a fragile reaction. Or maybe they have a discussion and then they learn something out of it, and the bond becomes stronger, the relationship becomes stronger. And in this case, it is anti-fragile. So we've seen how fragile, robust, anti-fragile is not really a trichotomy in which things are either fragile, either robust or anti-fragile, but rather the anti-fragile is also fragile and robust, but it also has the capacity to be anti-fragile. Let me explain with this chart. So the top figure, this one, describes something which is anti-fragile. So you see on the horizontal axis, we have the magnitude of stressors or variation of problems. And if, for example, it's hit by a small problem, the fragile doesn't react. It's hit, even though this entity as a whole is fragile, it is hit here in the robust zone. And therefore, nothing happens. That's what happens in the teacup that you drop from 5 centimeters, for example. It doesn't break down, it doesn't benefit, it just exhibits a robust behavior. And instead, if you drop the teacup from 1 meter, for example, you hit it here in the fragile area, and it breaks down. Conversely, the antifragile, which is here, it has 3 zones: robust, antifragile, and fragile. For example, if you go to the gym and you lift only half a kilo, that won't do much, and the reaction is robust. Your muscles, they neither grow, neither break down. If you go to the gym and you lift, let's say 15 kilos, then you're likely to have an antifragile reaction. You break down some muscle fibers, but then that causes the muscle to grow and you benefit out of it. And if you lift too much, let's say 50 kilos, you're not used to it, then maybe you might have an injury. That is a fragile reaction over here in the red area. So as you can see, the antifragile has the capacity to exhibit both robust, antifragile, and fragile reactions. It depends on many things, on how big is the stressor, the problem, and the internal organization, how strong you are, and so on and so forth. But generally, everything which is antifragile has this kind of three-colored chart that describes its reaction to stressor. Now, I'm making a lot of simplifications because, for example, here I'm assuming only one dimension. But that can help you understand how the antifragile reacts. Now, the red is obviously bad because it leads to a breakdown, and the green area is good because it makes you stronger. But what about the yellow area? Is it good, bad? You don't care? Well, it depends. Because in the short term, if you only get small problems, they don't do much, they don't hurt you, and that usually feels good. But in the long term, if you only have small problems, or if you have no problems at all, then you might have atrophization and maladaptation. Atrophization is loss of strength. So for example, if you never exercise, you never go to the gym, you never run and so on, your muscles, they only receive small hits in the yellow area. And as a result, they will get atrophied. You will get weaker. And the same, of course, also happens to know-how. If you have a skill but you never practice it, you might perhaps lose the ability to exercise it. And then we also have maladaptation. That happens, for example, in a group of people. If you have problems in the green area, in the group of people, there will be some form almost of natural selection. And only the competent will remain, only the good ideas will remain, and so on. But conversely, if you never have hits in the green area, only hits in the yellow area, bad ideas, they will not be destroyed by hits in the yellow area. And therefore, maybe bad ideas will spread, the population will adapt bad ideas, and as a result, it will get weaker. Other forms of maladaptation, as for example, when a company adapts to temporary trends. For example, there is no downturn in the market for a few years, and the company over leverages or decides not to keep cash in the bank. And then at the first downturn, it will get weaker, it will get at risk. I just want to clarify that the problem is not when you get hits in the yellow area, but it's when you don't get hits in the green area. Nassim Taleb in his book Antifragile reports the great sentence by Frano Balovic in which the antifragile use it or lose it. So Frano Balovic explains that the fragile, for example, your car, it's use it and lose it. The more you use it, the more you're likely to damage it. Instead, the antifragile is use it or lose it. If the antifragile needs to get hits in the green area, or otherwise it gets weaker. We also can see that in organizations. So if an organization doesn't have problems, if their employees, they do not see problems at least somehow regularly in their work life, then it leads to complacency. It leads to loss of know-how. It leads to politics. I've seen that a lot of times when employees do not have good business problems to think about it, then they begin talking about gossips and about politics. And that's usually not good for the company, and so on. In general, what happens when you don't have hits in the green area for long enough, the system gets weaker and more fragile. And what happens is what you see here in the two charts, about before and after. So before, the threshold between the green and the yellow area was here, and after, it moves here. It moves here. And again, also the fragile between the green and the red area, it moves to the left and it shifts here. And as a result, the green area shrinks. And that makes the system less antifragile. Why is it bad? It's bad because it makes it more likely to break down. So here, for example, you get this stressor over here, the red vertical arrow, before it would have hit the system in the green area. It's not bad. It doesn't cause a fragile reaction. It doesn't cause a breakdown. But after, the same stressor hits the system in the red area, and that's bad. It might cause it to break down. And also this fragilization also makes the system less likely to adapt. So the same thing, here you have this stressor, this vertical red cross. Before, it would have hit the system in the green zone, and it would have led to an adaptation. But now that the system is weaker, it hits it here, and it doesn't cause adaptation anymore. And that is bad. Now, I'm making some simplifications on how fragilization looks like, especially because the left threshold might actually move left or right. But I can explain it much deeper in a further video. But right now, the idea is just that the smaller is the green area, so the less antifragile is the system, the more it becomes likely to break down, and the less it becomes likely to adapt to problems that happens in the future. I want to clarify one point that I usually get asked in my courses. Sometimes students, they ask me, Luca, but a yellow area seems good to me, because yellow area means that you do not have small problems, or that you do not get hurt by small problems. Actually, no. Only in the short term, the big yellow area is good. In the long term, it's bad because you become less likely to adapt. In the short term, adaptation doesn't matter. In the long term, adaptation is everything that matters. It's a bit like, if you think about it, in the short term, efficiency is very important. In the long term, efficacy tends to survival. Sorry, efficiency tends to survival. In the long term, you don't really care about efficiency, you just care about survival. You can also think about it. Imagine that you have a car. In the short term, you define efficiency as the number of kilometers that you the numbers of liters of fuel that you use divided by the number of kilometers. But if in the long term, a machine that is less efficient but more resistant will be able to make more kilometers. And in a machine which was more efficient but broke down, it doesn't matter how much liters of fuel you add, the residual efficiency will still be zero. You will still not move it. So in the short term, adaptation doesn't matter. But in the long term, it's everything. And that's why in the long term, you want to have a big green area, like here above, even if it comes with a smaller yellow area. Okay, now I just want to talk about how this visual framework is useful. I and my students, we find it very useful, not just because it helps visualizing how something antifragile reacts to stressors, but also because it's very practical and it enables to answer a question such as, how do I become more antifragile? So what does it mean, for example, to be more antifragile? So you can see here you have two entities, one at the top and one at the bottom. Which one is more antifragile? The second one, of course, because it has a larger green area. And we've seen that that means that given a problem, for example, this stressor, this red arrow, the second entity is more likely to adapt because the green area is larger, so it's more likely that a stressor causes it to adapt, causes it to undergo an antifragile reaction. And also, the second entity, the one which is more antifragile, is less likely to break down because this big stressor over here, it hits it in the green area, not in the red one. So let's see how you can use the framework. You can ask yourself, how do I survive more? How can I survive more? And that means, how do I shift this threshold? How do I shift it towards the right? How do I ensure that big problems do not lead to breakdowns? And then you can ask yourself the same question. How do I adapt more? How do I ensure that smaller problems lead to adaptation? This is a very good question to ask yourself. Because a lot of companies, for example, they say, I want to become more antifragile. And usually they think it with the end goal of surviving and adapting to the market. They only look at the red part. But the thing is, the path to surviving more passes from adapting more. And to adapt more, you need to ensure that you will adapt not only to the big problems, but also to the small problems. And the reason is because the big problems might be so big that you won't survive and you won't have the chance to adapt after it. And that's why it's so important to adapt to problems which are not yet big enough to hurt you. And I know that usually we are very busy, and that means that we would like not to have problems. But counterintuitively, we need, when we see a problem, our reaction should not be to hide it under the rug and say, I don't have the time to deal with it, especially if it's not a big threat. But rather, it's about seeing it as an opportunity to know that something is not perfect, and maybe we need to take action. Maybe we are not strong enough. Maybe we're strong enough for these small problems, but we might not be stronger enough for the larger problem. So let's see more in details those questions, and let's try to provide some answer. So how can you survive more? How can you shift this threshold to the right side? The question that you need to ask yourself is, given a problem, what causes the wall to break down? Because sometimes you have a problem that can be well absorbed. And sometimes you have a problem that causes a chain reaction and causes everything to break down. What can cause this chain reaction? And here are some answers. Maybe you are too stretched. Because if all of your employees are working at 100% capacity, that looks very efficient, but then if you have a problem, it will cause everything to break down. Conversely, if your employees are working at 90% efficiency, for example, when you have a problem, then you have some spare capacity to address it. And that means, for example, that also problems will not get hid under the rug. But if there is some extra capacity, people will have a chance of maybe looking at the problem and addressing it. Now I'm making it a lot easy, because usually if you tell people just work at 90% capacity, what happens is that they will still fill the 10% either with unnecessary meetings or with other work and so on. So the easy part is not saying, let's keep some spare capacity, but it's in actually keeping this extra capacity in practice and making sure that it will get used when there is a problem. And I talk more about these in other videos, and also in, I have actually a course on anti-fragile organizations in which I talk very much about the how. Now let's see more just the what. Here we're just seeing an overview. Another reason might be that everything breaks down because your system is too weak. Its components are too weak. They cannot face problems. They cannot solve problems. They break down. They do not have enough know-how, for example. Or maybe you have too much correlation. For example, if all your employees, they have the same background, it might also mean that you have the same blind spots. Or too much correlation might be, for example, that all your supplies came from the same supplier. Or you have multiple suppliers, but they are all in the same geographical area. And if there is a natural disaster, all your suppliers are correlated, and even though you have multiple suppliers and you have the illusion of redundancy, you will still not be able to get in components. So that's, for example, what happened to Toyota in the Fukushima incident of 2012, the nuclear plant. Toyota thought that because they have multiple suppliers, they are able to withstand problems. But because the suppliers were all correlated geographically, they were in the same area of Japan, what happened is that a relatively small problem, like one nuclear plant having a problem, caused actually a very big breakdown. And here are some action points that you can take to move that threshold to the right side to make yourself more antifragile. One is to build redundancy and buffers. This is tricky because redundancy might also introduce complacency. So you need to be sure that on one hand you build redundancy, but you also do it in a way that doesn't introduce complacency. And there are ways to do that that I talk about in other places. You can use trainings. You can use drills to spot weak points in advance, and you can decrease the correlation that you have. Correlation here, I mean it in a lot of senses. For example, geographical correlation. You want to have more suppliers. You want to have them in different places. You want to have multiple employees. You want to have employees with different backgrounds. You want skills not to be correlated. For example, cross-training means that you have different skills. The same skill, you have it in different people. So it means that from the skill point of view, it's not correlated with people, because you have for one skill, multiple people, rather than having one skill, one person. These are all things that help reducing fragility and help moving the threshold to the right, making the green area larger, and therefore making the company or the organization more antifragile, or yourself. Now let's see how you can move the left threshold to the left. That means to adapt more. That means that this stress over here doesn't hit the yellow area anymore, so that you don't have no adaptation. But because you move the threshold here, it will hit the green area and it will cause adaptation. So that the question is not just how do I become more antifragile, or how do I make the green area bigger, which is not a very actionable question, but it's how do I ensure that small problems cause adaptation? And that both means how do I make small problems evident, how do I get to know about small problems, but also how do I ensure that I solve a small problem, that I do not just put it in a to-do list that I will never act upon, for example. And some answers include removing bureaucracy, for example, because bureaucracy is something that causes small problems to go unresolved. Another answer is you don't have enough feedback, and then you must think about how do I get more feedback? How do I get better feedback? How do I ensure that feedback reaches the right people that then can act upon? And basically all the question of how do I ensure that when I have feedback, it will actually lead to adaptation. One thing, for example, is maybe when you have feedback, it doesn't lead to adaptation because the feedback is too generic. I make an example. Let's say that you have an employee and you're telling him, oh, your presentation is very bad. That feedback is too generic and it will not lead to any adaptation. Maybe because the employee will take it personally and will react defensively, or maybe because he will know that he has a problem, but he will not know what to do about it. Instead, if you make the feedback more specific, you also make it more actionable, and you make it more likely to result in adaptation. For example, if you tell someone, oh, your tone of voice during the presentation was too low, then you give him something very actionable, and you make it more likely that he will adapt. Yeah, you fight defensiveness. Another thing is also, if you have a short-term focus, that causes problems to be swept under the rug, or to be put in to-do list that no one will act upon. And some ways that you can address these problems, we've seen less bureaucracy, more frequent feedback, more specific feedback, more actionable feedback, and making the important urgent. I usually say that the very important never looks urgent. Also something that Stephen Covey talks about. And the reason is because the urgent is never very important if you think about it. Everything which is urgent is never what you will remember, is very often not what you will remember in 10 years. And the things which will actually change the trajectory of yourself, of your company in the next 10 years, they never look urgent. And you need to make them artificially urgent. Again, now I'm just giving some very high-level answers. I'm more talking about the what's rather than the how's. I know that the hard part is how to actually do it. This is something that I talk, for example, in my books and in my course on antifragile organizations. Now, the questions that you want to ask yourself is not much how can I be more antifragile, which is not very actionable, it's very generic and doesn't lead to good insights. Rather, you want to ask yourself the question. You want to draw this chart for yourself, the chart with the 3 colors, and then ask yourself, what happens after I'm hit by a stressor? For example, after I'm hit by a problem here and I'm hit, or when I'm hit by a small problems. And you want to ask yourself, would a problem this big cause me a fatal problem, cause me to break down? And how can I become more likely to survive it? How can I decrease the likelihood that a big problem will cause my demise? So you do not want to ask yourself, how do I make big problems less likely? Or you also want to ask yourself that, but you also want to ask yourself, how do I make sure that I'm more likely to survive a big problem? And then the second question is, how am I more sure, how can I be more likely to adapt from a problem, to benefit from problems? And this is a very good question that can lead to answers that will make you more antifragile. Now, of course, there are some limitations in this framework because it focuses on the reaction to a stressor. It doesn't talk much about where the stressors come from, how am I exposed to them, how do I decrease the chances that those stressors happens in the first place. And then also it assumes that all problems are similar, that there is only one kind of problems. Instead, life is much more complex. There are trade-offs. Each one of us and each organization has multiple of these charts, one for each kind of problem. And usually there are trade-offs. You become stronger to one problem, but you make yourself more vulnerable to another problem. So it's not so simple and easy as I've painted it in the last 10 minutes, but using this framework is still useful because it will give you insights that move you in the right direction. And especially it shows that antifragile is not a binary property where you are either fragile or antifragile, because all of us, all organizations, all companies, we are already antifragile. The question is, how much antifragile are we and how we can become more antifragile? So you ask yourself not, do I have a green area? You already have it, but you ask yourself, how do I increase the green area? And usually there are two classes of solutions. One is by hitting the green area, so using training, drills, and so on, that will make you stronger. And by moving the thresholds, you want to move this right threshold to the right, and you want to move this left threshold to the left. One more thing I want to talk about antifragility. is that we all have it. We are all antifragile because we all, if we lift, for example, the right amount of weights, our muscle will get stronger. So antifragile is a superpower because it enables us to benefit from problems. It enables us to adapt to an ever-changing environment. But like all superpowers, it also comes with a responsibility. And the responsibility is what we were talking before, what Antifragile, the book by Taleb, talks a lot about it. And it's this sentence, use it or lose it. It's the fact that the antifragile comes with the superpower that if you get hit in the green area, you will get stronger. But it also comes with the responsibility that if you do not get hit in the green area, you will grow weaker or you will maladapt. And some example of things which are use it or lose it, your muscles, of course. If you use them, you get stronger. If you do not use them for too long, you get weaker. Your skills is the same, your values, your habits, and also your employees in a company, for example, and their skills. And I will say that an important part of management, for example, is to ensure that your employees get enough hits in the green area. For example, that they face problems that they are not too hard so that they hit them in the red area. And then it might cause frustration, they lose morale, they disengage, maybe they want to quit. But also that they do not only work in the yellow area, because otherwise they will grow complacent, they will engage in politics, maybe they will disengage, maybe they will maladapt, so they will hone skills which are not important for the business, and they will rely too much on them, for example. And instead, you, as a manager, as an organization, you want to make sure that they still face problems now and then. Not too many, of course, because then there is a mechanism which mechanically goes under the name of fatigue, which is that damage accumulates and you need to leave some time for healing. But you also want to make sure that they somehow get some hits in the green area now and then. And that means it's something that you want to keep in mind, for example, when you give feedback to people, is how do I give feedback that doesn't hit them in the red area, doesn't hit them in the yellow area, but hits them in the green area, for example. Part of the solution is to give feedback or to expose people and systems and processes and procedures and whatnot to problems in a progressive and multi-level way. By progressive, I mean that you grow the green area little by little. So for example, you might start with some employees which are disengaged. It means that they have a very small green area. And that means that almost all problems, for example, will either hit them in the red area. For example, they don't know how to handle it, they lose even more motivation, they get even more frustrated. Or the problem is so small that they will not even consider it. And no matter how disengaged is a person, for example, they will have a green area. And if you manage to hit it, you will grow it. And over time, that will make the employee more engaged, more competent, and so on. Now, of course, I'm not saying that this is the solution to everything, and also alone it won't work, but it's something that you want to keep in mind. And then also adaptation, antifragility must be multi-level. And I usually explain it with this chart. Okay, for example, think about a company that fires one of its weakest employees. That's something that makes the company stronger over the long term. It's like a hit here. However, for the employee that gets fired, it's terrible. It's a hit in the red area. And yes, firing a very bad an employee which is not good enough might be good for the company, but it's not very good for the employee. And can we benefit from this effect without having to fire the employee, for example? And the answer is yes, because if we give feedback to the employee that something is not good enough and he must change it here, the employee will go stronger, will change what he needs to change without having to be fired. And that's still good enough for the company. So in this way, if you look at the level below and you focus to adapt the level below, so for example, you don't think about the organization level, but you think about the employee level, or it could also be, for example, procedure level, you manage to get the same benefit from adaptation with less downsides. And for example, one way that you can see it is that you can think that also employees, they're made of mental patterns. Maybe they have habits, beliefs, things, how they think that things must be done, the way they make presentations, the way that they talk to clients, for example. And these also, they can be adapted. And the thing is, if you give feedback to an employee too late, for example, in the year-end review, you're likely to hit him in the red area. And that's not good. But if you give feedback on one of his mental patterns, then you're more likely to cause him adaptation without damaging him. So to sum it up, change is inevitable. Natural selection, in a way, sounds very bad, but it's also inevitable. But you can influence the level at which it happens. And a lot of antifragility is about pushing adaptation and natural selection down so that you save most of the organization, most of the groups, and even the individuals. So for example, if you like, change can happen at the level of the organization, or can happen at the level of the employees, or can happen at the level of the mental patterns of the employees. And if you manage to give feedback on a mental pattern of an employee, for example, you can cause him to adapt without suffering to it. And also the organization adapts without suffering to it. Now, this is kind of the result. If you manage to decompose an organization into employees and mental patterns, and if you manage to push feedback and problems down, then you get almost to expand this green area here. And you minimize damage. Okay, let's see the summary so far. So antifragility is the capacity to benefit from variation, usage, problems, and feedback. Not just to survive them, but to benefit from them. Antifragility is made of two parts, surviving and adapt. Because on one side, user antifragility comes with damage, and you need to survive damage to adapt. And then it also comes not just with surviving, because surviving is what the robust does, but it's with actually adapting. It's actually benefiting from problems. And you must focus on both. Usually, a lot of people, when they think about antifragility, they think about only survival. That's not correct. You must think about both survival and adaptation. You must not only ask yourself, how do I make it more likely that I survive a problem, but also how do I make more likely that I will benefit from the problem? How do you make adaptation a more likely reaction? And then we've seen the burden of antifragility, the idea that you need somehow to be put to use, to put the antifragile to use, to prevent maladaptation. And of course, you need to do it in the right way so that you don't damage, you don't cause yourself an injury, for example, but you actually hit the green area. Just now, I've talked about damage. And just to conclude this video, it's very important that we talk about damage. because damage is what determines how the reaction of something to problems. In particular, if there is no damage, then there is no reaction. So if something gets has a robust reaction, so the extent of the yellow area depends on whether there is no reaction or not. Antifragile reactions are usually caused by sparse damage, which means a bit of damage here, a bit of damage there, but not enough to cause a breakdown. For example, you go to the gym, you lift 15 kilos, that causes a couple of muscle fibers to break, not too many. And as a result, you will get stronger. The next day, your muscle will regrow and will grow more than they were before. However, if you have too much damage, you undergo functional impairment, it breaks down, there is a fragile reaction. So again, if you go to the gym and you lift a weight which is too heavy, too many muscle fibers break, and then you tear your muscle. So the position of the thresholds in this model is determined by the type of damage that a stressor causes. So you cannot really know in advance what's your chart for yourself or for your organization, but you must observe, like, here is a problem, what's the reaction? Does it cause the damage? How much? And that's what will determine the reaction. If it causes no damage, then there will be no reaction. If it causes just a bit of damage, then there will be an antifragile reaction. And if it causes too much damage, there will be a fragile reaction. Now, again, making some simplifications, but it's just to give you a basic idea of how it works. What causes an antifragile reaction? There are two mechanisms usually. One is overcompensation. There are different kinds of overcompensation. One is, for example, you go to the gym, again, you break a few muscle fibers, and your body will regrow the muscle and then some more. So it's not just healing, but it's healing and building more in expectation of an even bigger stressor in the future. Nassim Taleb talks very extensively about this in his book Antifragile. And then the second, let's say, big class of antifragile reactions are natural selection kind of types of reaction. For example, you have a population and there is a war, and the war causes the weakest, some of the weakest soldiers to die. And then as a result, only the more fit ones are left to reproduce their ideas, their ways of fighting, and so on and so forth. And as a whole, the group benefits. Then, of course, also natural selection, for example, follows a chart of this type. So, for example, if too many people die because of an event, you have a fragile reaction. For example, a tribe in which 50% of the people die in a war, it will not get stronger, it actually gets weaker. It's more vulnerable to a second war. But also, if no one dies for too long, or if no one gets kicked out from an organization from too long, then the risk is that you have some form of complacency, maladaptation, and so on. And instead, what you want is some form of damage now and then. Then, of course, kicking out people, you don't want to necessarily to do that. And that's why you want to think about alternatives with this multi-layer model. You want to push adaptation down layers. Yeah, part of antifragility is about getting smaller damage earlier. So that's what I was talking before. You want to get earlier feedback. So for example, if your product is not good enough, you want to know it earlier, not before you invest too much in it. And then you also want to have more specific feedback, and you want to give more specific feedback. Because again, if you tell your friend that his presentation skills suck, he will not learn anything out of it. If you give him more specific feedback, he's more likely to accept it, and he's more likely to learn something out of it. So how you can get sparse damage? Yeah, so this is why I was thinking, I like to think about antifragility in terms of damage. Though it's not the whole picture, it gives you some good questions, such as you don't think, for example, just how do I get feedback that will cause adaptation, but how do I get feedback that will cause something to break? Then, of course, you don't want to break people, or you don't want to break organizations, but you want to break their components. So maybe you want to break their mental patterns. And by this, I don't mean like in a bad way, but I mean, for example, making if the way they're doing something is wrong, make them realize that one of the ways that they're doing things is not good, so that that mental pattern figuratively breaks down, and the result is an adaptation. So how can you do that? How you can create a bit of damage earlier where it's needed, and without causing breakdowns? Some ways are making feedback more frequent, ensuring that it reaches down the organization and causes adaptation, increasing redundancy, decreasing correlation, thinking about damage in terms of exposure, thinking about antifragility in terms of exposure. This is something, again, that is talked, for example, in the Antifragile book. Capillarity is a term that I use to define how information flows down in an organization. So sometimes there are organizations in which information flows down, such as one email from corporate, and that is unlikely to cause much change. And user information, instead, it must flow down in a capillary way. From the top to the managers, to middle managers, to supervisors, to employees. And that's not much because we want to have a structure for the usual benefits of having a structure, because usually there are also a lot of problems. But because there are some changes, there are some adaptations that can only be transmitted by someone who knows you well. And someone who knows you well is someone who is close by. So for example, the CEO might not know the employees well enough to give feedback or to give information that can cause change. For example, a common reaction if too high-ranking manager comes to an employee and tells him, oh, you should do something different, is maybe the employee thinks, oh, he doesn't even know about this procedure. He doesn't even know what my job is about. Whereas if that comes from the supervisor, which is close by, maybe was working the job before, has repetitive, frequent interactions with you, maybe you will think, you're more likely to think, oh, maybe he has a point, and you will actually react with an adaptation. I call it capillarity because think about it, in our blood, oxygen can only be transmitted from the blood cell to the muscle cell, for example, if it's close by. The heart cannot just magically pump oxygen. The lungs cannot just magically pump oxygen in our body. They need to reach it from close by. And that's why our arteries, they divide into capillaries, because you can only change what you reach from close by. Yeah. And then, of course, there are more solutions. There are more ways to do that. Now I'm just giving a very brief overview. Now, I don't want to give the impression too much that also we want to have top-down processes, like top-down ways of giving feedback, because usually what happens a lot is that the top in an organization maybe doesn't know which feedback is important, doesn't know which direction it's correct to adapt. And if it tries to define that too much top down, there are a lot of problems that might incur. So everything which I've talked about right now, it's not just giving feedback like internally, but also getting feedback from the environment, teaching people how to get feedback from clients, from the environment, from suppliers, from procedures, from whatever. So I just don't want to give the impression too much that this is top down, because too often there is the problem that you do not know from the top what is good. And instead, it's more like you want to have an organic process in which change and adaptation comes from. You want to teach people how to tinker, for example, how to make experiments. Yeah. So that was it for this very brief overview of the way that I like to think about antifragility, which of course is neither the first, neither everything, but it's just something that I think is one tool which is very useful, complementary with other ways of thinking about antifragility. So next, I plan to release a video on feedback and metrics, much more practically, to think like today we saw the importance of getting feedback, of getting it early, of ensuring that feedback causes adaptation. And in this video, I will talk a bit more about how to do that. And so you can subscribe to my newsletter and to my YouTube channel so that you will receive this video. And then I also have a course on antifragile organizations, which I run every now and then. The next applications for the next editions are on. You can find it at this address. And what you've seen in this video used to be the first, the first third of the very first module of my course, and I've decided to make the first module public, just to show some of what we do, and to help people just also think about antifragility and realize some problematics and some basic solutions. In the course, instead, I focus much more about how to make an organization more antifragile from the point of view of a manager or even of the entrepreneur, how to make it more survive more. And that's not things that come from theory, but that's things that come from practice. I've been seeing hundreds of companies myself. I've worked with many. I've been myself a manager leading people, so I know very well what I'm talking about. And I know how to translate this way of talking about antifragility into practical actions that you can take, and that you can take into the way that your organization already works for the most part. And then as a last thing, in this video, I made a lot of simplifications. I didn't go too much into details of how the chart works, what justifies the chart being the way it is, what are the thresholds between the green, the yellow, and the red area. And I will also make a follow-up video that goes much more deeper into the details. Thank you. And if you have any questions, you can always write me an email. There is a contact form on my website, and I read every single email that gets to me. Thank you.